A wealthy businessman came home early from a trip, only to catch his wife fooling around with another man by the pool. But he didn't confront them. Instead, he quietly slipped into the bedroom, where the messy scene sent his blood pressure through the roof. Still, he didn't say a word to his wife. Instead, he began crafting an elaborate plan for revenge. That evening, his wife came home and seemed a little surprised to see him. "Weren't you supposed to be back next week?" Mike didn't bother explaining. He just walked over, pulled her into a warm embrace, and whispered how much he loved her.
I love you.
I know.
The moment she turned away, he raised a handgun and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The gardener outside heard the gunshot and rushed to the door to check. Mike fired 3 rounds through the window, sending the gardener scrambling. Then he moved his wife's body to a different spot, picked up the shell casings, wiped them clean, and tossed them on the floor. He threw his blood-stained clothes into a fire and washed every trace off himself. Once everything was in order, Mike didn't leave. He sat and waited for the police, or more precisely, for one person in particular. Sure enough, officers arrived shortly after, and Mike immediately requested a private conversation with an officer named Paul. That's right, Paul was the man sleeping with his wife. At that point, Paul had no idea who the victim was. He didn't know Mike, and he didn't know the woman's real identity. It wasn't until he noticed the photos on the wall that it hit him. The woman on the floor was his lover. He rushed over and found she was still breathing, barely. Meanwhile, Mike stood behind Paul with the gun. Paul quickly grabbed the weapon and tackled him to the ground. Officers outside stormed in and restrained Mike. His wife was rushed to the hospital, and as Mike sat in the back of the squad car, he flashed Paul a chilling smile, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. 3 days later, a preliminary hearing was held. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Will, a sharp young attorney with a 99% conviction rate. This seemed like a slam dunk. They had the murder weapon, and Mike had signed a full confession. The trial was supposed to be a formality, but then Mike made a series of moves that stunned everyone. He waived his right to a private attorney, insisted on representing himself, and demanded they skip the preliminary hearing and go straight to trial. Will found it a bit odd, but he was confident he could handle a case like this in his sleep. Then a phone call from a colleague stopped him cold. A closer analysis revealed that the gun recovered from Mike's home showed no signs of having been fired. The shell casings found at the scene had no fingerprints. There was no gunpowder residue on Mike's hands, and his clothes were spotless. None of it could serve as direct evidence. That's when Will realized why Mike was so confident. He had covered every single base. Still, Will wasn't too worried. "The confession is still on the table," he told himself. He signed it. "I'll make it work." Before long, the trial arrived. Mike looked perfectly calm, even casually sketching on a notepad in the courtroom as if the whole thing had nothing to do with him. The proceedings began, and Will called his first witness, Mike's gardener. The gardener testified that between the time the shots were fired and the police arrived, no one entered or left the estate, making Mike the only suspect. Next came the second witness, Mike's wife's attending physician. Based on the bullet's trajectory and the severity of the injuries, the doctor concluded that Mike clearly intended to kill. His wife survived only by sheer luck, which constituted attempted murder. The judge then asked Mike if he had any objections to the testimony. Mike, still doodling away, casually said he had none. Finally, Will called his third witness, Officer Paul, the one who had arrested Mike. Now Mike sat up and paid attention. After Paul finished recounting the arrest, Mike immediately raised an objection. He rose slowly to his feet and declared that Paul had no right to testify because he'd been having an affair with Mike's wife. The courtroom went dead silent. Will was blindsided. Paul, furious, lunged at Mike and tackled him, which only proved Mike's point. Mike went further, claiming the confession had been signed under duress from Paul. Just like that, every piece of evidence the prosecution had fell apart, and the case was turned completely on its head. Will finally understood he was dealing with someone far more cunning than he'd expected. He couldn't afford to underestimate Mike any longer and had to start from scratch. First, he went to the villa where Paul and Mike's wife had been meeting and pulled the surveillance footage, but the images were too blurry to identify anyone. Then he searched Mike's office for anything useful, only to find that Mike had anticipated this too. Right on schedule, Mike called and mocked him, declaring that Will would leave empty-handed. Frustrated but out of options, Will headed to the hospital and tried reading books aloud to Mike's wife, hoping to wake her so she could testify. But the doctor delivered a devastating blow. The brain damage was too severe. She was almost certainly never going to regain consciousness. A vegetative state was the best-case scenario. With the final trial just a day away, Will's last hopes crumbled. He was at a complete loss. That's when Paul approached him with a proposal. He could arrange for someone to provide false testimony, guaranteeing a conviction. Will refused on principle, but seeing the woman trapped in a vegetative state, knowing the real killer was walking free, it started eating at him. After agonizing over it all night, he handed the fabricated evidence to his assistant and told her to act on his phone signal during the trial. Yet his conscience wouldn't let him go through with it. After a fierce internal battle, he put down the phone. When the judge asked if there was any new evidence, all Will could say was, "No, Your Honor." With no other choice, the judge declared Mike not guilty of attempted murder and released him in open court. The case was closed. It was the first defeat of Will's career. Just then, a gunshot rang out from outside. Will rushed out and found Officer Paul. The scandal had destroyed him. Unable to bear the public shame and powerless to bring his lover's killer to justice, Paul had taken his own life. Mike, meanwhile, looked thoroughly pleased with himself. He'd killed 2 birds with 1 stone. He then headed to the hospital to finish what he started. He demanded that the doctors disconnect his wife's ventilator. As her husband, he believed it was his call to make. When Will found out, he scrambled to file an emergency restraining order, but it was too late. By the time he reached the hospital, all he saw were the flat lines on the monitors. For the first time, Will felt truly hopeless. He knew the truth. The killer was standing right in front of him, and there was absolutely nothing he could do. The case sent Will into a long spiral. Then one day, a random incident gave him an epiphany. A colleague accidentally grabbed the wrong phone because they had the same model. That tiny detail made everything click. He raced to Mike's house, found the key handgun, and finally pieced together the entire truth. Mike's pistol was the exact same make and model as Paul's service weapon. His real reason for visiting the villa had been to swap guns, so the weapon used to shoot his wife actually belonged to Paul. Then Mike arranged for Paul to enter the room alone for a negotiation, with both men supposedly laying down their weapons. He knew that when Paul saw the woman he loved shot on the floor, he'd lose control. So Mike deliberately let Paul grab the gun and walk away with it. The real murder weapon had been in Paul's possession all along. The truth was finally out, but Mike remained unfazed. He knew he couldn't be tried twice for the same crime. Even if Will had figured it all out, what could he really do? That's when Will showed why he was the professional. The attempted murder charge couldn't be retried. True, but the situation had changed. Mike had ordered the doctors to remove his wife's breathing tube, causing her death. That was a whole new charge: murder. And now that she was dead, the bullet still lodged in her brain could finally be extracted and matched to the weapon, blowing the case wide open. Mike was hauled back into court, but this time, would he manage to beat the system again? The film doesn't give a clear answer. So, what do you think?